Hey, I'm Espen Kraft, thanks for watching. To us older guys, the name John Bowen has a special ring to it. The man is a legend among us synthesizer enthusiasts and electronic musicians. He was the guy that made a lot of those classic synth factory presets from synths like the Prophet 5, the Six-Trak, the Prophet VS, etc. John Bowen worked on the Korg Wavestation and the Korg Oasys, and later on with Creamware, and he is of course also known for his own synth that bears his name, the John Bowen Solaris. So it's with great honor and my privilege to welcome you, Mr. John Bowen, onto this channel today. I hope you're doing well. And John, for anyone not familiar with your name and what you have been doing all these years, how did you get involved with synthesizers and electronic music to begin with?
Well, hi, Espen. Thanks so much for inviting me onto your video journal here, and really honored to be able to speak to you and your group. So how did I get interested in synthesizers? Well, I've always liked sound, been fascinated by sound. I started out playing drums as a 10-year-old. Took up piano, then bass, and played in symphony music, band music, and also had my little group through high school. And I guess probably what triggered my interest in the way sound was put together, or music was put together, was the Beatles' White Album track called Number 9. Because it was just unlike anything that I had heard. And I know a lot of people didn't like it because it wasn't a traditional song, but I was just fascinated by how they used sound as musical phrases and notes that repeated, and it had a lot of similar aspects like a song would, but that just fascinated me. And shortly after that, I would say I'm in high school, say 16, 17. I had a little band, and we were doing mostly blues, but I heard this record called Music for Electronic and Older Instruments by Mel Powell, Vladimir Ussachevsky, and Otto Luening. And there was a piece on there that I just loved the sound of it. It just totally mesmerized me. And so I actually adopted some of that into one of the songs that my little band did. In the middle section, it was like the guitar solo, except for it was the cassette player solo. And I just would turn around, hit the cassette player, and then have it stop after, probably a couple of minutes. Anyway, totally loved that idea of mixing sound, and started to really think about how does sound put together. I'd take tapes and I would turn them upside down and play them backwards, and all of these different things, just fascinated by sound. So go from that to being exposed to synthesizers. I was playing in a group in 71. We were booked up near Seattle, actually. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, but this band was playing in Seattle for like a month. And I was just reading about synthesizers and totally fascinated with them, the idea of them. And went to see an ARP 2600 at a music store. They had one at a store not too far away. And I went in there and I said, "Can I play with it?" And they said, "Sure." And they had a room with glass windows so they could see who was in there, but could shut the door so they didn't have to listen to it. And so I went in and I fooled around with it. And I was just, after about 5 minutes, I couldn't make any sound on it. I didn't know how to do anything. And frustrated, I went back to the front desk and I said, "Do you have the owner's manual for this? And would you sell it to me?" So they did. They sold me the ARP 2600 manual for $5. And I took it back to where I was staying. And every night after the gig, we'd play till like 1:45. And then I would read and study till probably 4 in the morning and make notes and stuff. And after about 3 or 4 days, I went back to the music store and manipulated enough sliders to get a sound, and I was so happy. So after that, I was back down in the Bay Area and took a guitar player friend of mine over. I said, "You got to see this synthesizer thing I just learned about." You know, I was so excited to show it to him. He's a good friend, best friend of mine. And the first music store we went to in San Francisco did not have an ARP 2600, but they had this mini Moog thing. And of course, I didn't know anything about that. And I looked at it and I said, well, there's the oscillator. Okay, so we kind of saw, I saw the same names and listened to it. And we left the music store after a short demo of that and went to another music store about, 5 minutes away. And they had an ARP 2600, so I went ahead and played everything and showed him my new knowledge of how to make things work. And then when we left that store, he goes, that one didn't sound the same as the other one. And I said, well, it has to, because it's all oscillators and filters of what I had learned from the ARP 2600 manual. And that should, basically everything should be the same. I mean, that's such a great teaching manual, by the way, that book. Anyway, we went back, listened to the Mini Moog, and I said, you're right, it has a different quality, and we couldn't figure out. And I was kind of disappointed because I really wanted to get a 2600, even though there's no way I was going to afford it. But that Mini Moog sure sounded big, and I'm just like frustrated now, because now I would like that sound better, but I couldn't afford either one of them. Anyway, so that's how I got interested.
And so you got involved with Moog. How did that happen?
I was playing somewhere in a little small club outside of Sacramento. And one night, I was only there like once a week. One night I came in and said, "Hey, you just missed the guy from Moog. He was here playing banjo." And I thought, "Oh, that's really odd." He said, "Yeah, but he said he was a salesman for Moog Music," so I couldn't believe that. And I had, between the time of showing my buddy the Mini Moog, I had actually gone back to San Francisco and rented a Mini Moog for a weekend, and was able to put together with him and a drummer an Emerson, Lake and Palmer tribute kind of thing. We did Tarkus. So I worked really hard on getting the sounds for that and learning how to, make the Mini Moog do that. And we actually put on a gig and played, and I recorded it. So that was like summer of 72. And then in the fall of 72, I went to a consumer show, and there was Norman Millard, and he was representing Electrocomp, which is a East Coast company. And so I was just so excited about synthesizers by then. I told him, can I help, do you need help selling on the West Coast? And he said, well, we're not quite there yet. We're not ready for that. So darn. Anyway, so a few months later, we're talking 1973, probably like February. This guy with a banjo came through town, and I didn't see him, but I was working at a music store. So then I went down and said, there's a NAMM show, and a trade show coming in March in San Francisco. Now, this was only the second year they'd done a spring NAMM show in San Francisco. Normally they were every year in June in Chicago. So this was an opportunity for me to go down and find out more about this banjo guy. Doc Bochenik was his name. And I went there, got in because I was working in a music store, went up to the Moog booth right away, looked for his name tag, Doc. I said, "Doc, we have mutual acquaintances back in Sacramento when you were playing there. How did you get involved as a banjo player, and could I get involved? So he turned around, he says, let me introduce you to my boss, who was a family friend, as it turned out, David Van Covering. And Van Covering was head of the sales for Moog at the time. Turned around, and this guy had these really thick glasses, so his eyes kind of were bigger than normal. Anyway, he looked at me and he did this, you could be our next. I mean, he was such a great salesperson, and he had this charisma and charm about him. And so I told him I would love to work with Moog somehow. And so he said, send me resumes, send me anything you've got musically. And I had taken that, I had recorded that Tarkus stuff we did. So I sent him a cassette of that and a little bit of a resume. I mean, I'd been in bands, didn't have any real job experience other than that. And a couple of months later, I got a letter saying, we'd like you to come back and basically work at the trade show. So in early June, I think it was, 73, I went back to Moog Music, got off the plane, and Van Covering was not there. And it was this new guy, Tom Lamb, told me that David had left the company. So I was in shock because that was the only connection I really had. So they took me through the factory, got to meet Dr. Moog. They had me prepare for the Chicago show in June, at the end of June, the NAMM show there, and had me make presentations of the MIDI Moog. So I just was there not knowing what was going to happen, but I spent the 3 or 4 days or 5 days showing off the MIDI Moog. And at the end, I said, look, I have 2 plane tickets. One takes me back to Buffalo, New York, which was where Moog was, Williamsville, or back to California, where I'm from. And what's happening? What am I going to do? Because I'm going to have to leave, as they were packing up the booth. So Dave Luce, who was recently hired there and was in a vice president position, went around and asked Tom Ray and a number of the other Moog people who had all sat in on my presentations, what do you think? Should we hire this guy? So he came back after about 40 minutes and he said, I'm very happy to offer you our first official clinician job for Moog Music. And I was just so elated. I get paid to play with synthesizers. It was fantastic.
And while working for Moog, John met up with some other highly interesting people at the time.
I got involved with Sequential Circuits, and the way I did that was I was doing these presentations on the West Coast for Moog Music, go in the music stores and, just work with the salespeople there. And they would send me around between LA and Seattle, so just West Coast only. And I started to want to have a little more going on than just my 2 hands. Usually it was bass and or a Sonic 6 doing a 2-note chord and some lead stuff or something else. So it's really difficult. They also provided me, by then Norland Industries had purchased Moog, so there was a Maestro drum machine that I used. And anyway, I wanted to have a sequencer somehow, and I was living in Oakland at the time. So I just decided at one point in 1970, this would have been like 76, I wanted to find a sequencer. So I opened up Keyboard Magazine, and there were 2 companies that were advertising. One of them was EMU, and the other one was Sequential Circuits, and they were both in San Jose, which was, like a half-hour drive. So I thought, well, I will approach these guys, both companies, and see what they have. looking for a standalone sequencer that I could use to supplement my live performance demos. And so I called Emu first because I knew kind of about their modular system and stuff. And I said, yes, I'm trying to make it very official, right? So I'd say, yes, this is John Bowen from Moog Music, and I'd like to come down and talk to you about what you might have in terms of sequencing that might be useful for me. Maybe I can promote something for you while I'm doing, what I'm doing. And I'd like to come visit your factory. And they said, well, we don't have a factory. We just have a 2-bedroom apartment down here. So, but you're welcome to come down and see it. So, okay. And I called the Sequential Circuits number and I did the same thing. Yes, I'd very much like to come in and see the company and see what you have. And I talked to Dave's wife, as it turned out. She said, well, we don't have a company, we have a 2-bedroom apartment. So in any case, I first went to Emu on Homestead Road. They have a 2-bedroom apartment. They had no furniture hardly except for a big modular system and a couch and a coffee table in the front room. And Scott Wedge and Dave Rossum lived there. And I think one of their girlfriends was also living there. Anyway, they came out and they showed me their polyphonic keyboard sequencing thing. And it was pretty obvious that there was no way that that could be done as a standalone thing that I could take with me. So, but we had a very pleasant exchange of, synthesizer enthusiast type things. And then at the end of that, I said, well, I'm going to go over to this Sequential Circuits place next. Do you guys know anything about him? And Dave Rossum said, oh, yeah, we sell him our clock module that he uses to run his sequencer. So he says he doesn't really know all that much about synthesizers right now. So it was kind of an odd thing. But I left their place and I got the address and I went over to the apartment listed, went to the door and Dave's wife answered and said, he's not home yet. He's still at work over at, I think he was waiting for Xerox. And they had a dog that was very yappy and barking incessantly at this strange person at the door. So I said, well, I'm going to go back and sit in my car and I'll wait in, half hour or whatever. Went back up. Dave was there, took me in, showed me his sequencer, the digital sequencer, the model 700. And, it was small, easy to use, would work, hopefully he had it running with a mini Moog because the mini Moog was his inspiration to get started. And he had built a couple of these things and sold 2 or 3 of them, I think, to San Francisco State and another guy down in Monterey, Len Sasso. And anyway, I could see that this was a perfect addition to my presentations. And I said, well, if you give me one of these, take around, I'll take literature and I'll promote it on the side. And in fact, the first NAMM show, I guess technically, although not officially, was Dave in my room showing the sequencer, Model 700, to people who might be interested. And I was in the Moog booth, in the Moog area doing presentations, and I did have some of the literature there. And I think one of the executives from Norland questioned me about it, and I just said, oh, it's, no, not a big deal. But anyway, I was using the sequencer and taking it around. So Norland Industries decided to go in and reduce their sales presentations to just a guy working out of Chicago. And I, at that point, was in a band that was about to get a recording deal, and we were that was my focus, really. And we had, since I had worked for Moog, I had a couple of mini Moogs on my account. So I was in this group called Nielsen Pearson Band, and there was a keyboard player who played guitar, and he was covering bass, because I was doing bass and keys. He would cover the bass using the mini Moog when they needed me to play more keyboard stuff. Otherwise, I would play my fretless electric bass. And but he didn't know anything about how to program the synth. So Tom Oberheim had come out with, his the modules, the 4-voice and the 8-voice, and introduced a programmer module that managed not every parameter, but just some of the important parameters, envelopes and cutoff and oscillator tunings and so on. So I asked Dave Smith at that time, who was still doing the sequencers, if he could build something that I could use to program the mini Moogs. And he said, okay, well, you sketch out, what you think the front panel would do, I'll do the same. And so in collaboration on that was our first project together. And after that, when I was no longer with Norland, I went to the first NAMM show that Sequential officially did, and I think that was 77 in Atlanta. And we had a mini Moog there, and I think we had some modular system there. And anyway, most of the people that came by the booth to see us were, could you just combine the programmer with the synthesizer? That would be great. And Dave was, no, I only want to do accessories for synthesizers. I want to get into actually building a huge keyboard. So, but on the flight back, Dave and I talked about, this is my feedback. Everybody's asking, can you build a complete instrument? Anyway, so that was in June of 77, and then I think July, just shortly thereafter, Dave called me and he said, hey, you know that idea we were talking about that I didn't think we should do? It looks like it's possible. There's a new set of chips from Solid State Music coming out, and that Dave Rossum actually was helping design. And for whatever reason, EMU wasn't going to try to build a polyphonic programmable, but Dave decided that would be his good chance. So he breadboarded this, what became the Prophet. We didn't have a name for it or anything. But again, he told me, he says, you lay out the front panel of what you think we should have, and I'll do the same. And both of us coming from mini Moog backgrounds. It was very similar. Of course, I wanted to have 3 oscillators, and I knew if I was going to end up doing programming for it, making sounds for it, which was kind of unspoken, but that's what was going to happen. I just wanted a synthesizer that was all programmable that I could use with the band, right? Anyway, I knew from my work with the Micro Moog and the earlier Moog stuff that I really liked audio rate modulation of the cutoff, the filter cutoff, and the things you could do with that. So my design for the Prophet had a 3rd oscillator and an extra envelope generator, just a simple one, AR, I think, so that you could modulate audio rates, the cutoff from the 3rd oscillator, or you could do, but with hard synchronization, you could sweep the pitch and you get that nice, sync sweep sound, which I had seen Roger Powell do in a demo on an ARP Odyssey years before. Anyway, so Dave came up with the breadboarded product in like 2 months and had the prototype ready in time for the January 1978 NAMM show in Los Angeles, and everybody was there waiting for it. And Dave actually worked I don't know, 30 or 40 hours without sleep. And he brought it down. He flew it down Friday morning. People were already there, had heard somehow a rumor about it. And he showed up around noon. There were no programs. I had to go into the back of the booth and quickly put together like 10 sounds. And, I guess you could say the rest is history after that. We got so many orders, and I got a small percentage of the company at that point and ended up proceeding to do things on the side for Dave. The 10 voice was the next thing. And, I did all the factory presets for that and the 10 voice and the original factory programs on the 5. And I remember the fella that I had rented that mini Moog from, Pat Gleason, ordered some of the first profits, and he told me, he says, "You're crazy to give away your programming. You should be charging for it." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm going to get I'm thinking I'm getting a free synthesizer, so I just wanted it for the band." Anyway, band had records out. None of the records really took off. I was in Los Angeles. Dave called me. He said, "Are you ready to stop trying to be a rock and roll star now? Because I can offer you a full-time job." So in '82, I left LA and ended up full-time at Sequential Circuits, and was responsible for product development, some user support, all the presets for all of the instruments, from the Prophet 5 on to Prophet 3000, which I have behind me there. Although that's a sampler, right? But still having to make presets for all those instruments, Prophet VS. Also, he was responsible to create the VS wave shapes with a special program that Josh Jeffy had written. And anyway, pretty big part of my background is based on my Sequential Circuits life.
So with Sequential going out of business, they were bought up by Yamaha, which in turn had John working on some other highly now considered classic synths bearing that Korg name.
At Sequential Circuits, the first soft menu-driven instrument was a Prophet 3000. Then I did the layout and the design for the screens and so on. And then we got bought. The company was going out of business, so things weren't doing so well. So Yamaha bought us and put us on a project called us DSD. I think they wanted it to be Dave Smith Designs, but Dave didn't want to use his name for anything. So we came up with a lot of other alternate names that fit the DSD, and some of them were pretty funny. In fact, I have a T-shirt with all of the names printed on it. But it was just a handful of us, 6 or 7 people, kept over from Sequential for DSD, and we started on something called the F8, which is really the predecessor, kind of the Wavestation. Kind of. Because I was, again, doing soft key menu-driven interface ideas for that. And then a year after that, Yamaha cut loose a couple of companies. They had a group over in north of San Francisco with John Chowning and a number of other people. And then they had our group, and they let us go. And then the same week, Korg came by, and I guess they had been in communication, Yamaha and Korg, about us. And so the head of Korg came into the engineering lab, and I was pretty surprised. What are you letting this competitor in? Anyway, we ended up all getting signed to Korg by the end of the week. Same week we got let go on Monday, and we're signed up by Friday with Korg. And I took the soft key design and we applied it to a new synth depending on what Korg had in their hardware, the kind of the chip they had, the filter chip they had, which didn't have any resonance, and we had to kind of modify our plans, but continue to work and produce the Wavestation for Korg was as our first instrument. And my thing there, I was the product manager for that. My thing was, since they had done so well with the M1 and all of the sample-based instruments, that we should do something that was not stock, not the normal thing. So no piano in there, no drums, which of course the marketing people didn't like. So that was changed after the first product came out. But anyway, got started with Korg and did the Wavestation, and then we were put on to all of the Wavestation, follow-ups. Then we had acquired a guy from, while we were doing DSD with Yamaha, a fellow who was a great DSP engineer, Steve O'Connell, and he had been working with Yamaha before. So we ended up getting him and started design on the Oasys synthesizer, which Alex Lamberis, the manager at Korg R&D, after Dave left, after I think 6 months, his deal was when Korg took over. He didn't want to stick around. I think he wanted to kind of just be on his own. So we forged ahead with this, with the Oasys open architecture synthesis. And the idea was, of course, with a digital design, you could mimic or do a lot of things. Physical modeling was Steve O'Connell's main focus. So Korg had to make a custom chip for that process, and that was very expensive. And we had to work on a new design. I continued to be in charge of user interface stuff, as I had been doing all that time with Sequential as well. So I'd done all this work on the Oasys and done the presentation in Germany, and we did some more in Japan. And after all of that, Korg Japan decided that they would cancel the project. It was going to cost too much. I think they figured it would have been something like $10,000. So they didn't want to try to sell that keyboard. So, but we had all these custom chips designed. So they put it into the wave drum, and they put the chip into the 12 IO mixer. And then they said, well, maybe you can make a PCI card using that chip so we could run it on the computer. So at that point, I started having to deal with software front end for the DSP card, the PCI card. And the graphics were a program that I had to deal with on the Mac was pretty primitive looking. And I'm going along working on this thing in 1997, and got news in early 98 for a company in Germany called Creamware that they were making a similar idea. It was a DSP card, PCI based, plugged into a computer, and it was a digital emulation of a mini Moog. But not only was the sound accurate, but the graphics were part of the system, and the graphics to me looked like a photograph of the front panel. So I couldn't believe that, because I was struggling with this really plain looking interface for the PCR card for Korg. Anyway, I had a vacation planned that summer up near Seattle, and I knew that Creamware had an office in Vancouver, Canada, and an ex-Korg guy was one of the new owners of it. So made an appointment with him, went up to see this Pulsar, or actually it was called Scope program, to see if it really was graphics and audio all in one, and how could they do that. And I gave it a listen, and I saw the power of the program, and I thought, oh, we're not going to be able to compete with that. So I asked them if they would be interested in hiring me, and they were quite surprised that I would be willing to leave Korg for this new startup. But it was what I thought I would do. So I ended up switching companies. In August '98, I was over in Germany trying to learn German Windows and designing a software modular system in 3 weeks for their new board, which is the Pulsar board. But one of the things I realized once I started working with the Scope software, which made it so easy to piece together anything you want as far as a synthesizer. I made 4 plugins on my own. I worked for Creamware for a year, and then there were some financial problems with them, so I quit. And then I decided I would continue by making plugins for that platform. And it took me about 6 months to come up with 4 synths. And they were pretty basic products, but it did help me establish that whole world of working with software synths and learning the Scope program. And it was a lot of fun because you'd sit with it and you'd sit there, after working on a finished product, and a couple of months later, you'd get ideas or you'd get feedback from customers, and you'd go, yeah, and that could be nice if we do that. And then you can just continue to add it. Because again, it's software. You don't have to deal with, with hardware where you have printed labels on the front panel assigning a specific thing that you can't change and all that. So that was the attraction to software synthesizers, but I still missed having the tactile interface and the knobs and the control, the immediate control, instead of using the mouse to get to everything. So that went on for a while, developed a good customer base. Probably the most well-known one was Hans Zimmer, and he had me working on some specific projects for him. Like he had a Waldorf Wave, and he wanted a version of that in his Scope system. So anyway, so I did all these plugins. I ended up having about 12 finished products, and one of them I kept really developing and adding stuff to it. And that plugin was named the Orion, but eventually it changed so much from the original thing that I decided to rename it the Solaris. And I picked that name because of the Kraft movie. So the Solaris represented my biggest project, my most complete project, most satisfying, because it had all of these things in it, multiple filters, multiple oscillator types. And when I was constructing it, I guess in the back of my mind, I was thinking perhaps someday I would have a hardware version of it, but wasn't really that much in the plan. However, when I would go to the trade shows in Germany, I would see the guys from Creamware, the engineering team that I had originally worked with, and they would come over and I would be showing my software plugins over at a different booth. And they say, John, you really should do your own synthesizer. They were always saying that to me. And I'm like, no, it's crazy. It's too expensive. It's too much work. And I didn't have any way to do that. I didn't know how. But at Creamware, they did have a hardware product that was a keyboard with multiple synth engines in it. I can't remember the name of it right now. Anyway, so I figured, well, they of anyone. They know, how to do that. Anyway, so in 2006, the Creamware company had gone through a couple of reorganizations, and most of the people had left. But two of the guys contacted me, and they said, we've always talked about doing a hardware project, and the German government at the time was offering financial assistance to companies that wanted to start new technology companies that were startups. And so they had heard about it from another keyboard company, that this project was available, this financing was available, and they had to do like a 500-page proposal and send it in. So they did that, and I think around May or June. And then by August, they had heard back that they got the go-ahead. But to do that, they had to have a customer with a project in mind. So I was their customer, and it wasn't defined at the time other than a synthesizer of some kind. We didn't really know what we were going to do. Of course, back then, there was still a lot of interest in a Prophet 5 copy, and there was really nothing going on. Creamware had done a mini Moog one, and I can't remember. Actually, they may have worked on Prophet stuff by then, because I was using the modules, the scope library modules in my Solaris plugins for that. Anyway, so we got the financing for this. We hired a engineer from Finland, and we started work on it. And it was totally, there's so much to learn. I had no idea about the hardware challenges and how to put all this stuff. I mean, how 1 millimeter can affect your design, the knobs being off, and so on and so forth. But I had this plugin to guide me as to the kind of functions I wanted. And it was my best-selling plugin, and they had the most function, and it translated fairly well into a hardware piece. So that's how the Solaris got started. I decided, instead of doing a Prophet 5 remake, why not just hit the ground with a new, fully featured, like a big project, but I didn't realize how big of a project it was going to be. I mean, we showed the prototype in January, February, must have been around February, for the Frankfurt Music Messe in 2007. And everybody was totally surprised because, I'm not a company really, and just a single guy, but I had this support with the ex-Creamware guys, which their company was formed under the name Sonic Core at that point. And they had made an arrangement with the Creamware guy, and they were sharing the intellectual property. So we had access to the code that was in all of the scope libraries, but we didn't start with that. We started with a complete new engineer. And after the first show, where we introduced it, we had a huge response because no one expected it. We lost that first engineer from Finland, and were able to actually acquire the engineer who had done all of the scope stuff in the first place, who had always been telling me, one of the guys always been telling me, John, you need to do a hardware piece. So anyway, that's how we got started with the Solaris project. And 2007, it turned out I went through 5 prototypes, and each time that's really expensive to do. And I had this first prototype, and I took it over to Zimmer's place, and I've shown it to him. I found while I'm trying to show it and demo it, and same thing at the trade show, some of my ideas didn't work as well as I wanted. So we changed a bunch of stuff, went back, had to add more coding to the synth, and it started to grow and grow. What they always call feature creep in the business. And with a software synth, it's easy to do, like I said, but with hardware, not only do you have certain limitations, you have financial limitations because you're paying these guys to write the code, and you do want to get the product out eventually. So, I got to the point where they're like, okay, you really need to finish up, stop growing this thing, and we'll go ahead with it. And so we finally shipped the first units in 2011. So after we had the first units come out, I wanted to continue adding things to it, but didn't really have the finances to do that. We had a number of hardware issues in terms of production. Like 25% of the circuit boards of the main motherboard were faulty, were failed. And no one was able to say why. None of them were ever addressed or repaired. And so we lost, out of the first 100 units that I ordered and paid for, we only shipped 76 of those. So we lost quite a bit there. And they said, well, if you want to be able to ship 100 units, you need to order more. So I figured I ordered, the next round was 125, if that's how much I was going to lose. And we shipped 99 out of those. So the first two rounds, there were like 50 units that I could never sell. And it put me behind at that point, and it was always been tough because of that, because really I'm not a big company, obviously, just by myself. And the synth has really been a labor of love for me, not a huge money-making project for sure. But then things kind of went downhill from that because we lost the coding guys, and so we had no real software progress for years. Then in 2017, I think, I had a Solaris owner who was a coding person, and he came forth and said, would you like me to work on it? And it was just an unbelievable offer, because since then he has done incredible work improving the system, and Jim Hughes is his name, and just fantastic. He's been a tremendous help, and he's managed to fix like 100 bugs in the first month and added tons and tons of things to the operating system. So now in 2022, we have what was a lot closer to my original concept. It's started out being a mono-timbral synth, and always had in mind a 4-part multi-timbre instrument. So now we do have that with the latest version 2 software. And Jim's just come up with these great ideas on his own, and adding things to the Solaris that just has made it so much better and so much more fun to use. So that's kind of the current state of things, and he's going to continue to develop stuff as we can. I had two things in mind that I really wanted to do, that I had seen not happening out there in the marketplace at the time. And that was really great audio quality and ease of use factor. When I talk about the audio quality, I had come from, working with Korg and Yamaha briefly and Sequential, and there was always this push to have more voices, more polyphony from the marketplace or from the salespeople. And to do that, you have to compromise in some cases, at least back then. And so I had the option when the engineering team at Sonicor was talking to me about how to approach, what we were going to design. And he said, well, you can probably get double the voices if we run it at 48K internally instead of the 96 that you want. And I said, well, I'm really looking at the best quality sound we can get. I'm not so worried about polyphony. And everybody told me, no, that's the wrong way to go. But I have to say, the feedback that I got from my scope plugins, from the Solaris plugin and other plugins that I did, generally people wanted to have the quality as the first issue. At least my audience did. So I just stuck with that, and I said, no, I want to run it at 96 kilohertz. That'll give us better fidelity and better quality. And since then, I've had quite a number of people saying, yeah, that was the right way to go. When I looked out there, when I was going through the initial design idea, I would see that, people would have the product that they put out in the market and assign labels, and then later add like a new filter type. But to get to that new filter type, you'd have to hold down a couple of buttons and do sign of a special code because they couldn't redo the front panel printing. And I really wanted to avoid that. So with the Solaris, that's why I have the encoders, and when you select the oscillator type, for example, you just can dial through the type. And when we added types, like we added the Casio CZ series this last time, you're not constricted by what's printed on the front panel. It's a way to address always being able to expand it. And the other thing in the design layout, since I came from the old school hardware, on the left is the oscillator, and the signal path then goes to the mixers and then goes to the filters and then the VCAs. I kind of laid that out left to right. And I knew with the digital synth, because I had put so much functionality into this thing, that we had over like 1,250 parameters in it. That's so unwieldy. You can't have enough per function. So of course you have to do paging, and I really was hoping to avoid a lot of paging as much as possible. But anyway, that's why I broke it into those separate displays. I felt that would minimize having to menu dive and go deep into the thing. Now, I did the user interface, and I was the product manager for the Korg Wavestation, and that user interface really showed you the danger, let's say, of deep menu diving. You go down the tree to the next function below, and on and on, and it's pretty complicated. So try to avoid that by breaking the basic sections out, the basic food groups of the sound. So your audio stuff, the oscillators, the LFOs below that, mix in the middle, right side filters, everything to do with the envelopes and so on. And just try to, reduce the clutter of having all those parameters. And then everything else that was left over, we used in that center graphics display. And again, I put one button on there called More, not knowing how many pages of soft keys information I would end up with, but always knowing that musicians always wanted more, or synthesizer guys. So pressing the more button repeatedly would just step through pages and pages of things, or groups of functions, like the effects are all on one group, and the sequencers and the arpeggiators are in another group, and the envelope follower and the ring mod amplitude modulation section is in another group, and vector synthesis, and a lot of it, some of it is kind of redundant. You could do vector synthesis without that section. You could use mixers. Just it's a little more complicated to set that up for the user. So I wanted to just make it easier as much as possible. Well, isn't the Solaris just a scope board plugged into a computer? Well, not exactly. So one of the things is, yes, there's a DSP chips that are in the scope board that are also in the synthesizer. But all of the code that we did use from the scope library has been rewritten and maximized or optimized for this 96 kilohertz rate. And a number of the algorithms were changed to be more accurate. For example, we have the Waldorf wavetables. Thank you to Waldorf, by the way. And the way the interpolation works in the scope system, as you play down the keyboard, you'll notice that the output gets a little bit duller. Well, the interpolation scheme in the keyboard was redone so that it accurately represents what happens with the way the Waldorf wave shapes are interpolated as well. And by the way, those are the same, it's the same algorithm in the Prophet VS. Little story aside, when we were designing the Prophet VS, we did have a PPG system in the lab. And so we basically looked at that as a way to do the digital portion of the Prophet VS. So it's not exactly a scope system. And even so, if you look at buying a large scope system, you're spending several $1,000s for that. And on top of that, you have all of these displays and the joystick and the wheels and the keyboard and the housing. I mean, all of that costs money. So as far as future plans, we've shown a desktop, or I call it a tabletop because it's pretty large. But it's the same front panel board as we have already, because I'm really not able to redesign anything at this point. Just have to go with the current stuff I have. And so that's a tabletop version. It's doesn't have the keyboard, obviously, or the joystick or the wheels or the ribbon. It's just a simpler version of it, but it's the same motherboard, and everything else is the same. And that'll be coming out hopefully by the end of this year. We're, all of the people in the components electronics world are having shortages and problems getting parts, and it was no different for me, especially being a one-man company and trying to order things. A lot of these companies want you to order 10,000 parts, and way beyond what I can do. And then I have an agreement with Sonic Core that they produce a 1U version, which I call the voice expander. And that's going to be sold and produced by Sonic Core completely. It's almost the width of a full rack, not quite, but it looks like a rack piece in a 1U unit. So that's what we have coming in the future. other than that, can't really say anything at this time. So Espen, thank you so much for offering to do this video series with me. I've really been excited to see how you've done your presentation of Solaris. I know it's a little odd for some people that it's a 10-year-old digital synth, and for me, I'm just a small company. It's not like a Korg or Yamaha where Sequential, even where we had a new product, every year or every 2 years. It's really been a kind of an amazing experience for me. I learned a lot about how difficult it is to put together something in hardware and to design stuff and have it all actually work. I can remember I assembled the first 20 or so of the units way back when, and just sitting there finishing one and looking at it and going, I can't believe we did this. I mean, it's really something. It's amazing. And I do have all of the Sonic Core people to thank for that, because they made it happen. So that Holger Drenkelford at Sonic Core, Jürgen Kinderman, who's now with Feral Fish, Klaus Peel did the software. I mean, so many other people there helped, and we really made it happen. And so it's just extremely gratifying to be able to continue. I mean, people that have become owners with me, I sell directly on the internet, don't have it in music stores, have to take orders in advance to buy the parts for it. So it's just kind of like I said, a labor of love for me. It's just my own little project. But I've enjoyed the communication directly with customers. It's really gratifying to be able to do that. And again, I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the Solaris. Thanks so much.
A big thanks to you, John, for taking out of your time talking to us. We really appreciate it, and best of luck with the Solaris and everything you do. And as always, I'm Espen Kraft. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.